Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Alan Watt, standing in for Jackie Patru, who has sinusitis right now, probably due to the chemtrails that are being stepped up across the country. And I've got it too, actually, but we'll struggle through this hour. I talked to Jackie about half an hour ago. There's no real format for this broadcast. Generally there never is. It would just go off the cuff, so you'll have to persevere as I let loose whatever comes to my mind. This is the 1st of March, and it's 2006. We just witnessed the end of the Olympic Games. I don't know if you watched the end of it. I don't watch the games. I watch the beginning and the end ceremonies because they're highly telling with the occultic symbology they use in your face. And of course it was held in Turin in the north of Italy this year. And Turin used to be a stronghold of some of the ancient Cathars and so on, and Albigensians. And at the end ceremony, they showed you the oval rink or arena. Arena comes from Aaron, of course, priest, high priest, circle. And it's an oval shape, and they showed you the big flaming obelisk-type tower with intertwined serpents, really intertwined, making up the tower, and the fire coming out the top, symboling the fire of the regenerative force, or the issue from the phallus, basically, which you'll see in many Masonic obelisks across the country. They put one up for Kennedy after he was assassinated in Dallas, and that's got not a real flame shooting out, just a stone one. I guess that's because he was shot stone dead. But in this particular closing ceremony, they had dancers, hundreds of dancers dressed up like tarot cards. And the commentator said it is because this region at one time was heavily into the tarot card reading, and actually had permission apparently at one time to use them from the church, and then it was withdrawn again, and then they were persecuted. And then the dancers made a circle, of course, the eternal circle. And then they made a 5-pointed star, which is the Masonic 5-pointed star that you see between Wall and Walmart. You'll see it in Freemasonry. You'll see it on the American flag and many others. That's fire, air, earth, water, and of course the added element is spirit. And they claim that the profane, the majority of the public, don't have spirit, so you only get 4 points instead of 5 if you're the average profane, you see. So I watched this Masonic parade with other actors being dressed up as red flames themselves, and going around this arena. It's quite fascinating to watch how everything is put right in front of your eyes, and the majority of the public listen to the songs that are played and might even dance to them, but they don't really know what they're watching or participating in, even if they're actually there. But the world is full of a particular hidden religion's symbology. It is all around us. It's on all main logos of your major companies and corporations, carefully hidden or slightly altered pyramids and triangles, and you have the double X, of course, of X and Val D, and you have the Cruxang Sata, etc., etc., etc. So we live in a world where we take everything for granted simply because all of that which is around us exists. You're born into it. And like all mammals, you look to your parents, your guardians, to warn you of danger. And if your parents were thoroughly brainwashed, then they don't warn you, they don't know. And then the child grows up thinking everything must have evolved this way quite naturally. And that's how easy to keep this type of system going. Whereas Lenin himself, who really had the best education by the top bankers on the planet, because they had to create an opposition to create change, directed change, that is. Lenin himself said that the public must never know that mankind could go off in 1,000 different directions. They had to believe the one they were born and live in is a natural evolution, and do it unquestioningly. And we do. We're born into it. And so we go through this strange existence we call life, where immediately you'll see your national symbols flashed in front of you at school or on television. You learn very quickly that soldiers are somehow special if you're a little boy, and I was little girls too, of course. And people who come from no background at all, at the very bottom of the ladder, will get somehow respect from the top of their country and all the citizenry if they wear this one form, this uniform. And they never question it from there on. We don't question what we're even taught at school, or even why we're at school, or who designed the school system, and who does it serve. And of course, what we're living in, as Karl Marx said, it's an economic system. Every system, since they call the birth of civilization, is actually an economic system. And by that, they call it civilization, meaning it was an organized priesthood, or many priesthoods, specialized ones like bureaucrats from the days of Sumer onwards, that also handled money in the form of gold measure, or later on gold coin, and of course controlled trade. And through trade, they created little factory towns in ancient Phoenicia, for instance. So it's never really stopped. And they even had free trade in ancient Phoenicia. If you think it's a brand new idea, they were already standardizing the coinage weight internationally in ancient times by the Phoenicians. And they wouldn't trade eventually. Once you got you hooked on trade and having your little toy beads coming in and all this kind of stuff, and even porn, they exported porn, which was chiseled or baked in clay with little cartoon characters, and I guess they even gave a prize to their own version of Hugh Hefner in those days. But they exported all the same stuff that's come down through the ages, and at the same time they brought other priests with them to give them the opposite of the porn, etc., meaning sin, and this is how you pay your God off, with little bribes called offerings, and maybe you'll be allowed to continue with your little sins in secret. So right up to the present day, we've been controlled by an economic system they call civilization. They say it has a plan. It's called progress. No one you will find defines for us what progress is, or those who keep talking about progress and never define it for us, I should say. Whose progress? Is it a progress to what ends, and to serve whom? Because we really are being shaped in a very ancient plan that the high occultists, and the high occultists, you cannot buy their books on the regular bookstores. The high occultists own all the big publishing companies that churn out the rubbish for the people. But they have their own inner archives for themselves and for their offspring, who take over from them. But they said that this great work, this great plan to perfect all that was imperfect, left imperfect by the grand architect of the universe, began 4,500 years ago. And this is this part of the plan, because there's many hints of previous ages and destructions and so on, possibly brought about by the same priesthoods who keep trying over and over again. And that's why when Sumer came on the scene, for instance, it didn't evolve slowly from guys dragging their knuckles across the desert floor like apes. No, they arrived on the scene with many bureaucracies as priests, a pantheon of deities to rule every part of a person's life, a full economic system with trade internationally. In fact, they even traded with India. And we're talking 5,000 BC or so. And They didn't learn this from picking it up piece by piece. You could even get a baked receipt from the supermarket, the open-air market, and you got it in 15 minutes, which when the computer breaks down at your supermarket, could maybe a bit faster than the present. So we're talking about an understanding of commerce, science and control of the mind of populations, to make people accept slavery and a definite caste system. A caste system where you have an inbred elite, even at the days of Sumer, and that's come right down to the present day. We see it in India too, with the Brahmins, who claim to be more perfected physically through their selective breeding, and of course they claim they have the best, highest spirits reincarnated forever to the present time. And we are going into an age now, we're into it actually, where the same mystery religion that ran all of the ancient world is controlling us, shaping our minds, because they laid they laid the foundations for this a long time ago. They shaped the mind for years in advance before the public even know their minds are being directed in a certain direction, and hence the New Age was brought in ultimately in the 1960s, first written about in a magazine called The New Age, which was the main publication of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. That was the title of it, The New Age. And they prepare the fields, which is your mind. They leave it fallow, then they plough it, then they harrow it, then they sift it, then they plant the seed. It can take generations to get to the crop that they want, but they have it today, and people haven't really noticed the rather quick changeover where in many bookstores, major bookstores, the large shelves which contained hundreds of the regular Christian books and so on have all disappeared, and they're all full of the New Age books. They think these authors just spontaneously arise, but they don't. And it's because the mind was shaped long ago for the readers, the present-day readers, to accept this new philosophy. Albert Pike, who was the Pope of Freemasonry, the world Pope of Freemasonry in the late 1800s, and wrote the main treatise on it, Morals and Dogma, for those below 33 and below, even though he himself was much higher and belonged to higher groups. Stated in there, it says that we have been behind every major revolution in the world. It said, and we never fail because we always lay the groundwork. We never begin a premature revolution. And that goes with all change in society, because most revolutions are cultural revolutions. They're non-bloody, such as the sexual revolution, the feminist, etc., etc. These are non-bloody, but they take a long time to work behind the scenes, prepare the ground, and eventually have everyone accept the new norm. This is part of ongoing revolution, which in high Masonry they call struggle. I struggle. That's why you find that even Adolf Hitler called it Mein Kampf, my struggle. It's all Masonic, you see. All sides are Masonic in every battle. Without battle, you cannot have change. And the laws of nature being in opposition to each other, such as winter versus summer and fall versus spring, show this. And of course, 4,500 BC, with the beginning of this part of the great work to perfect that which was left imperfect, they said they'd have to use the laws of nature. And change in society, the sheep, you see, the great mass of people are called sheep in all ages and have good shepherds. The sheep will not go in the direction they want them to go. In fact, they won't move at all unless there is a conflict between two sides on either side. And that way they're directed to the next pasture, which is the next part of the age. So the ancient occultists above what we know as Freemasonry, who've guided all of this, are simply destroying the old structure. They are builders, remember. They build society and they build culture. They're moving from the stage they've been at and used successfully for the last couple of thousand years of Christianity in different varieties and forms, and they're dismantling it. Of course, to be dismantling it for a while, it served its purpose. It kept the people obedient to a caste system in Europe, with kings and queens and aristocracy and nobility. They made sure that in the King James Version, they put in there that all government comes from God, just to make sure that they would obey, you see. And an oddest thing, of course, down through the ages is that these European countries, where the people were always recruited, given uniforms, often the first new clothing they'd ever had in their life, and became suddenly respectable before they went off to get slaughtered. It's awfully strange that the same techniques which were used then are still used today. They could never really click, and they never thought that how come they shouldn't kill, and yet it was okay to kill when their governments actually encouraged it. Not only that, you get medals for doing it, if you lived that long, that is. And you would have eventually ticker tape parades, and you'd be held up for your 5 minutes in the sun before you were cast off into the streets without a pension. So this is the reality of this incredible system, including its history, which we're given. How they can actually indoctrinate you never to stand up to a tyrannical system in your own country. And even when it is tyrannical, they can tell you to believe in God and God's watching you and don't kill. But when they tell you to go and kill for economic reasons for the elite abroad somewhere, the men just rush off. That's a tribal technique, a tribal instinct, which the elite understand. They bring out the cymbals, the brass bands, or the bagpipes, or whatever it is, and the young guys who run on hormones and cannot think, they're too young to know what's going on. They don't even know who they are themselves at that age. Run off and either win or lose. Although the elite never win or lose, you'll notice. Generally, the country's leaders at both sides will share the loot, the booty, as they used to call it. Whereas the people, it kept the populations down. So war fulfilled many functions. In the 20th century, war was preordained by Albert Pike and others of various high Masonic institutes who wrote about it freely at one time. And they said that there would be 3 world wars. One definitely with Germany, possibly 2 with Germany, but the third one would be Zion against Islam. And we're seeing that being fulfilled now. H.G. Wells wrote about that too in his novel version, Shape of Things to Come, where he even put Basra in as the focal starting point of the third one. And of course, he was in Britain when he wrote it, and in Basra is the major area and city that the British troops went into in Iraq this time. So these guys know the agenda, and we are simply living a script pre-written long before we were actually born. We can find many of the big players belong to the Trilateral Commission. The Trilateral Commission was formed from members of the Council on Foreign Relations for America, which is the American branch of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Any non-Commonwealth country is called a Council on Foreign Relations country. And we find that the Trilateral Commission was set up initially to bring in the 3 trading blocks that Karl Marx wrote about in the 1840s in Das Kapital. Karl Marx wrote this in London, and he was put up by the Rothschilds bankers, of course, because the rich men of the world always have run the world since they introduced their money civilization system. And they had to create an opposition to themselves, in a sense, or at least the appearance of opposition, to get the great work through. You must have what appears to be a direct antithesis to the thesis, and that's why they created a system which was supposed to declare that they would destroy capitalism completely and get rid of the old caste system and bring in a world with experts running it at the top and scientists, etc., run on reason and logic and yada yada, and everybody would serve the state, and of course the people at the bottom believed it, and the people in the middle management level got a different version, and then the ones up at the Politburo level and even above them got the real version. That's how it worked, you see. But Karl Marx wrote about the three trading blocks back in the 1840s, funded by the Rothschilds, who owned the Bank of England, and of course they also owned the banks in Germany and Italy and a few other countries. And you find that they funded the communists. Karl Marx, also, by the way, Karl Marx wrote letters to Abraham Lincoln. They're in the congressional records, because he congratulated Lincoln on upholding the unification of the Americas, or the United States, because in communist ideology, a strong central government must take over all laws, regulations, etc., over the entire country. And so for Americans who want to research that, you can look into your congressional records and you'll find that Abraham Lincoln was in correspondence with Karl Marx and had tremendous congratulations from the latter on his ability to keep this particular goal, which they both knew, they understood, but the masses didn't, in mind. During the Cold War that came on after World War II, there was a so-called arms race. That, again, is a great thing with war or pretend wars. They can tax the people to the hilt. The people think that they're being saved or protected. Meanwhile, the money was being funneled into NASA, the NSA. They all have NASA sounds because that's the Hebrew Aramaic word for the head. For the head of the Sanhedrin is called a NASA, or Nazi, if you like. And that is no coincidence. And so NASA has been putting more satellites up there for future use, which ultimately will do with the controlling of our ID cards with the active chips in them, which are now out in the open. They are definitely active chips. And ultimately the inserted chip is to come afterwards. The card is only a stepping stone. And all the technology was made through budgets getting funneled to these experimental labs to do with what's happening today, not with what's happening in the Cold War at all, to do with high-tech observation control of people through the trick of the elect, of course, which is electricity, which they knew in the 1700s they would use. Benjamin Franklin wrote about it, if anybody cares to look into it. So, electricity, computers, etc., were mandated for a stepping stone towards where we're going very shortly, which is to be a totally controlled world, where, as they said in their plan, their great plan, of course, they wrote about it, and they called it Revelations in the New Testament. That's written in such exoteric and esoteric language, which is typical of the ancient brotherhood. And they tell you right in there that the age would come where no one could buy or sell without the mark or the image of the beast. But it's a mark, really. And a mark, of course, can be a scratch, insertion, or whatever. You couldn't buy or sell. And, of course, the cashless society is coming along with this new ID card, which every country in the world is putting into place at the same time. And in fact, in Canada, they pulled out Stockwell Day recently and gave him his first thing to tell the public, which was that, well, the US is bringing it in, and Britain's brought it in, and other countries in Europe are bringing it in, and so we must bring it in too. We can't be left behind. And I guess that logic, which they always use for this kind of thing, would mean that if they're eating fetus in China, then I guess we should be doing the same thing here. So there's no logic. It's an agenda, and that's the reason it doesn't really make really sense to us. This ID card, according to Stockwell Day, will also be your international passport. He did say it's not just a national card, it's an international card, which will tell you that the regional and international computers, supercomputers, are already set up to take these things. And they were set up years ago because back in about 95, Canada bought 5 super Cray computers, and it was written about at the time. Each supercomputer could handle technically all the data in Canada, and the reporters in the Toronto papers were scratching their heads wondering why little old Canada was buying all these big super Cray computers. These things take buildings to put them in. They are nitrogen cooled. These aren't your little tabletops. So Australia at the same time, in the early 90s, mid-90s, was doing the same thing. And some reporters, I have them on videotape, talking in the mid-90s, were talking about this. They said, well, you know there's going to be a coming ID card, don't you? So they all know this. This is 9/11 was simply the Pearl Harbor event that Brzezinski talked about must occur to get the people motivated behind a war, which was to begin, according to his book, The Grand Chessboard, published in '98. It would begin in Afghanistan, which it did, and then go over to Iraq, then into Iran, then Syria. And they would finish off the job that Britain began of standardizing the world into a one system, one legal, economic system, educational system worldwide, because we all must become one. The real meaning of one is not what the New Agers are dreaming about. That's all the stuff that's been fed to them by the big boys who churn out their books for them. The oneness that the big boys are talking about is actually a zombie land, basically, a Borg land, where most of the public will simply be programmed for the work. They'll be unable to think of themselves as a distinct individual. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I think I'm back. But you get a bit of music there when it starts again. But first of all, I'll tell you that I'm on again on the X Zone radio tonight, which will be 1 a.m. Eastern, and that's broadcast on a whole bunch of AM stations as well as the internet radio. It comes out of Hamilton, Ontario, and that should be a pretty good program, I think. Or broadcast. I hate the word program because we're all being programmed. It's also being broadcast in Australia and the UK and other countries too. On March the 5th and 12th, I'll be on the internet radio, which is called Eye on the Future, with Hezbollah, and that I know that will roll well because there's a bit of interaction there which helps to give it a bit of fire. So things may be picking up. It's hard to tell how long we have really to discuss things which must be discussed before it's forbidden. We're almost at that stage now where if you say anything contrary to the present agenda, it's called anti-government, which is a direct translation from the Soviet term used over there, as was political correctness, a direct translation from the Soviet term. So the Soviet is actually here. The Soviet system is now merged with the capitalist system, and that's what they call the third way, which Mr. Gingrich was talking about as he tossed out Mr. Toffler's books called The Third Way. It's the merging of the two into the one system for global reconstruction, a communistic, overbearing bureaucracy to deal with every part of an individual's life, with the usual elite at the top above all of that, who are called the dominant minority, according to Plato. You see, they call them the dominant minority, the inbred group at the top who own the wealth of the world, with their helpers down beneath them. So this is the world we're going into, and it's it's a step-by-step world until they have literally us implanted with these brain chips, which are talked about at the Loyola meetings, the World Science meetings, sponsored by the U.S. Department of Commerce, where the scientists said it's all ready to go. All they have to do to get the people to accept this chip, insert it into their body, would be to start putting it into cartoons, promoting it at kindergartens and schools, and put them in novels and movies as a good thing to have. And they already are putting them in all of those things, of course, preparing the ground again, the field, plowing it, harrowing it, and then planting it. And the people will think it's a natural evolution once more. However, Arthur Kessler, who worked on this technique of lobotomizing the mind, said it must be done for world peace. Peace means peace from the people. That's what it means. It means that the people won't have to have entertainment and sports and all this kind of stuff to keep them occupied. It will simply be programmed like the Borg on the Starship Enterprise to do specific tasks. I'd like to thank a woman in Sweden who's been asking for my books. They should be out tomorrow. And she's a nice woman in her 80s. It shows you that age has nothing to do with following, studying, nor waking up to what's really going on. And in some people, they simply have that hunger, others don't. And we certainly cut through the nonsense that's out there, and it's top-heavy with nonsense put out by the big boys of Tavistock, who also shove the authors out there to write out thousands of books to confuse you even more. And that's always been the way they shape our minds into certain directions. So I'd like to thank Maria, and they should be out tomorrow. For those in Australia who were asking about the international meeting I read about from some time ago, it was actually, I thought it was in Melbourne, it was in Sydney, Australia, October 1938. It was the Royal Institute of International Affairs World Meeting, very important meeting, and they did have U.S. members there from the CFR. Every attendant from every country is listed in the back. All Australian delegates. They have the ones from New Zealand, Britain, Ireland even, and India. And in this book, they go through the entire structure for right up until the 2000 and beyond, to create a new world order, and as those terms, a new world order, and how they would use a structured system to control the people, a structured system run by experts, which of course that is also backed up by Lord Bertrand Russell, who wrote Science on Impact of Science on Society. So in this book, if you can get a hold of it, it was printed by the Oxford University Press, Toronto. It has a list of all the Royal Institutes, the Canadian Institute, the Australian Institute, New Zealand, South African, and the one from India. And the United States, of course, as I say, we're in attendance, has all your big players. And what you'll find in it is that the top leaders of left and right wings were all members of it. And this is a Masonic organization, by the way, because in Masonic law, They can speak equally on the floor, on the squared, on the level, as they say. And so they had all the people who would create the dialectic, the fight between left and right, etc. They'd have the leaders there hammering out the agenda and how they would make it work on the people. Their goal ultimately would be a world where people would have constructive world citizenship, and this is the very end of the book, in fact. Some members of the conference called it a world order, a new world order, some the good life, some spoke of constructive world citizenship, or the brotherhood of man, that Masonic term again. Still other words used, which might serve as a motto both for the Commonwealth and for the world order of which he and his companions dreamed, was to develop in each individual a sense of duty to his fellow man. In later conferences, they call it a sense of duty to the state. And in fact, to say that you would not be born unless they had a need for you to serve the world state. They go through the coming up World War II. They pretty well know they were going to win it. They said they would defend the Soviet Union at all costs. This is in this one book. This is the minutes and speeches of their meetings. And as I say, this was long before I was a gleam in my father's eye, you know. The whole future was in here. And of course, they also knew that towards the end of the millennium, Russia would just simply bring down its system and merge with the West. That was the merger, which Mr. Gorbachev talked about just before he left, when he was Premier of Russia. He said to his fellow Russians, he said, some people will say that communism is dying or is dead. He says, do not believe it. He says, we're simply moving out into the world to fulfill our destiny. In other words, that was always the plan, that once they had created this system, they'd merge it with the West, with the banking system, the dominant elite of the West, and they would run the world in a constructive, scientific manner where experts would run the show, intellectual export. And that's what we have today. Lenin also wrote about this same thing at the beginning of the 1900s. He said towards the end of the millennium and into the new, the world would be so top-heavy with bureaucracy and bureaucratic departments overreaching each other, that there would be some confusion. So he's quite right there, because we see that today with so many government departments literally stepping over each other on each other's turf. So in this particular book, this one from the meeting of the Institute of International Affairs, they talk about the possible necessity of bringing the United States into the war, possibly by an attack by Japan on the United States. This was in 1938, folks. So if you think things just happen, please just read your New Age books, burn incense, live in a bubble, chant your Om, eat your seeds and health foods, and just turn your back on what's happening, because you've effectively been disabled from participating in the creation of destiny. This world we're living in is actually participate in destiny. The New Agers are soaking up all these propaganda books, which are thinly disguised as promoting the new religion, to believe that 2012 is going to be the end of the world according to the Maya calendar and all of that. Well, I'll tell you, see those guys who represent the Mayans that they've dug up for some shows are all Masons, you see. Just like the American Indians were sold down the river by their chiefs who became Masons. Willie Bryant was one of their first ones for the tribes up in Canada and the States, and he joined the British side during the American Revolution, and he told some of his other members of the tribes to join the American side, which is typical dialectic once again. His son Norton took over as the Grand Master of the Federation of the seven, or the five nations, I think they called it. So we have the same thing in Africa too, with Mr. Mandela and all the usual leaders. They're all high Masons, and when you become a Mason, you leave your old family behind. And your new family is the new international brotherhood of Masons, you see. And that's who you serve. You swear oaths to do that. You no longer belong to the people who still identify with you. You may lead them, but you will lead them up the garden path because you're now led into the real agenda. And those ordinary people below you are the profane, the dark ones, live in the darkness, you see. And you simply lead them to where your brotherhood wants them to go. They are there to be used. And in fact, Albert Pike, the Pope of Masonry, said, those who will not use their own power of reason and intellect are nothing more than beasts of burden and meat on the table by choice and consent. And therefore, in that case, if that's their choice, then those who are the true predators have the right to use them. That's what it means by the law of nature. So they're nice guys, eh? This is the real intent behind it. It's a class caste type system. And they have all the New Agers reading all this Mayan stuff. The same tricks they pulled with Christianity for thousands of years. Well, geez, I mean, God wrote Revelations, didn't he? And God said it's going to all end, you know, and all this is going to happen, and there's nothing we can do because it's God's will. And here you come with this updated Mayan, prophecy, spontaneous prophecy. It's all going to end in 2012. And the New Agers say nothing you can do about it, you know, it's just written that way. This is the oldest con in the book. Chronology, the priest's con. Con is priest, by the way. So you hear all of this stuff, and it's rubbish. And the main thing is, you can find all the real stuff by the guys who implement it and plan it and write about it. Because Arthur C. Clarke was one of the highest Masons in Britain. And through 2 movies written in the 60s, he goes through the beginning of the push for the new way of things, which begins in 2001, hence the name of his first movie. And it was to be completed by 2010, hence the name of his second movie. You see? One of the highest Masons, and it's nothing to do with what you think is in the movie. It's set in space, and on Earth and in space, but it's actually the occultic journey. And you'll see the one guy overcoming the computer, the sun, Hal for halogen, halcyon, and Hal, H-A-L, each letter after the alphabet is I, and then you have B and M, IBM, the computer. He overcomes the master, you see, and becomes a god himself. In 2010, you have him coming back as a god who can go back and forth through time, never ages. And he tells all the people on earth something wonderful is going to happen. Can't tell them what, but wonderful is going to happen. Well, we know what it is because at the Loyola meeting, we've all have a brain chip by then. And they said we'd all be interlinked in a form of electronic telepathy. But they go further and tell you there'll be no such thing as an individual once this has occurred. It will be the end of individualism as we know it. Of course, the elite will not take this because they must retain their self-preservation, survival mechanisms, because they will be planning the destiny and steering the ship of Earth. This is where you'll find the real agenda. So they've been training everyone that we'll all be one, we'll all be one, and of course the New Agers are falling into it, not knowing, hey, it's going to be done electronically. Some will like it, some will think this is fantastic, being linked up electronically. It's a natural evolution. Well, I just wish I could find a planet for them to go to and leave the rest of us alone. Because if there's any natural abilities, they won't be used. In fact, you won't be able to cultivate any natural abilities. It'll be the end of that. So this is the real world we live in. It's been planned down through the ages for centuries and thousands of years to bring us to this step of a well-ordered, planned society. The United Nations, unentrenched UN, for one, is a sort of front man for this dominant minority who run the world, this inbred bunch that have selective breeding, like Charles Galton Darwin breeding into the to one family, the Wedgwood family, for at least 6 generations. That's all they married were Wedgwoods. He made pottery, so I think all the Darwins were a bit potty, and that explains it. Charles's own children, because of all this interbreeding for generations with him, his 10 children, 8 of them died right away. One ended up dying soon after, and I think the last one then died in an insane asylum. So then they started breeding with the Galton family, and so Charles Galton family wrote The Next Million Years. Sir Charles Galton, 1950s, wrote this book, boasting about the next million years they're going to control, if we let them, of course. And he talked about the culling of the majority, since we won't need them anymore. He says if the ordinary masses breed anymore, they'll overtake us, meaning the inbred elite, and wipe them out. So he says we better do it first to them. And that's where we're going today. All of the threats of war, this ongoing nonsense of terror everywhere, is all to get the public off balance, to allow the elite to terrorize us and dictate to us what we must do, and to give themselves the powers to do it. Interestingly, in 1998, Alan Rock of Canada, a sort of lifelong player in politics, who apparently is related to the Rockefellers, according to rumor, but I can't verify that. Alan, he's now, of course, ambassador to the UN. But when he was in Minister of Justice, he introduced an omnibus crime bill, which was introduced in the US at the same time by Mr. Bill Clinton. And this really is the same thing as this new anti-terrorism bill, and they were pushing it through in the 1998. And it has in it then, and it did go through here in Canada, because being a good democracy, we have no say in it at all. That's perfect democracy. In it is said that they could arrest anyone on any suspicion and hold them indefinitely without trial, meaning for the rest of their lives, and no one would know where they went, etc., etc. And even the reporters were scratching their heads saying, why is this being pushed now when the world's so peaceful and happy and safe, etc.? Well, Mr. Rock took his orders from people above the Prime Minister. He was in on the agenda, and they were preparing the road for 2001 before it even happened. Zbigniew Brzezinski put his book out in '98 talking about the need for this Pearl Harbor event. He belonged to the New American Century Club, a private club of the Bushes, Wolfowitzes, Cheneys, Rumsfelds, etc., who published their own agenda first in '92, then again in '98 themselves. It's still available apparently on some websites. And they go through the same scenario, starting with Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, and so on, and taking the oil. So we're just living through a script right now. And I want everyone to keep in their mind the 50-year plans, the 100-year plans, etc., of communism are being used by us today. We have 5-year plans for this part of the agenda, 10 for that, 50 for that. It's the same bunch running the same show as always. And that's why they have these MOs they leave behind them. Now, in October 2005, a reporter called Packer wrote in the Boston Globe and a few other papers across the country what a senior advisor to the Bush administration said to the reporters that day. And it's so important we realize that the advisors, you see, are more important than the front men. And Masonry number 1 is never the boss, it's always number 2. That's a Masonic fact. 2 is more important than 1. And the advisors are tremendously important because they're unelected. They are globalists because they all implement through their own presidents or prime ministers the same global agenda at the same time. So someone's training them, In the occult, they call them the grey men because their floor is the chessboard, the black and white, and they are the grey men. They move between one world and the other to the real guys who rule the world. So they write the scripts, the presidents read these scripts, and prime ministers. And this is what one of these advisors and scriptwriters said, printed in the Globe and Mail, October 30th, 2005. He said, "We are an empire now." Well, that's the new American century, you see, the club they belong to. "And when we act, we create our own reality. And while you are studying that reality, judiciously as you will," that's like some of them on shortwave, they just parrot what's happening today, "we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too." And that's just how things will work out. We are history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to study what we do. A statement from the senior Bush administrative advisor. And that's what they do. They gave us spins on everything. They give us fake realities. People should watch Wag the Dog. It went through the Bosnia War before it happened, just exactly as it eventually did happen. They put it in our face all the time. And those who understand what's happening must cultivate their own individuality, because the world they're creating is the world of absolute total collectivism, a worldwide plantation where people will be grown for their purposes to serve this world plantation. There are 1,000 years of peace, they call it, when we're all chipped and we're no longer us. We're an it, we're not a Borg, the original Borg, you see. And it's up to individuals not to keep their head down and be timid, because this is not something, a battle. This is a battle for the mind, for the spirit, for the soul of every individual that's ever lived before us. All the poor souls who've struggled and pioneered and done all the right things for thousands of years, but never knowing the agenda. And it's also for those to come, because we do not have the right to say, "I'm okay, maybe I'll get through this and retire before the end comes." That's the most selfish, opt-out, cop-out statement I've ever heard before. This is a battle for all time, for the past, the present, and the future. And people must stand up and be counted and say their piece and tell others, because don't be cowered by tyrant speeches and tyrant threats. You are an individual living divine being, and it's up to you to use that divinity. Really use it and let it shine out there. Anyway, that's all for tonight, folks. It was rather spontaneous, and I hope you tune in again next week when Jackie will be back on Wednesday, and Daryl will be in on Monday, Tuesday. Thank you very much. Thank you.